When we think about fighting climate change, we usually picture giant wind turbines or maybe solar panels on every roof. But what if I told you some of the most powerful tools aren't physical at all? They're ideas. They're economic policies. Today, we're going to pry open the Economist Toolbox and see the invisible levers that are really shaping our path to a greener future.
So that leads us to the big question for this whole explainer. We all know governments need to do something about climate change, but what can they actually do? What's really inside that toolbox? Think of it like a giant puzzle, and right now we're going to start putting the pieces together one by one.
All right, so before we can even talk about solutions, we've got to get our heads around the problem, but from an economist's point of view. And the whole thing really boils down to this one simple fact. When it comes to the climate, the free market is, well, it's broken.
And that's a really fair question, right? I mean, markets are usually amazing at solving complicated problems efficiently. But climate change? It's the perfect example of what economists call a market failure. And it all starts with this one super important concept.
It's called a negative externality. Now stick with me. It sounds complicated, but it's not. Think of it like this. A factory makes a widget and sells it. Great. But in the process, it pumps pollution into the air. Now, who pays for the cost of that pollution? The doctor's bills from asthma, the damage to crops? We do. Society does. That cost isn't baked into the price of the widget. For a century, we've basically let industries use our atmosphere as a free garbage dump. And that, right there, is the core failure of the market.
And honestly, it doesn't even stop there. A stable climate is what's called a public good. That means everyone benefits, which leads to the classic free rider problem, right? Why should I pay to fix it if my neighbor isn't? Then you've got the fact that we are locked into our current fossil fuel system. We've spent decades building it, so it's incredibly tough for new, clean tech to compete. And the biggest one, the real costs of what we do today are dumped on future generations. So the main takeaway here is pretty clear. The market, if you just leave it to its own devices, cannot fix this. Policy has to step in.
Okay, so if the market's broken, how do we start to fix it? This is where we get to the good stuff. Let's open up that toolbox and see what instruments policymakers actually have at their disposal to correct these problems.
And you'll see it's a pretty varied kit. You've got tools that work by making pollution more expensive, things like carbon taxes. Then you have others that just set a hard limit, a cap, on how much we're allowed to pollute, period. And then there's a whole other category of tools designed to boost clean energy, create brand new markets, and, just get the money flowing in the right direction.
And let me be clear, this isn't just theory. These tools are out there in the world, right now. As of 2025, policies that put a price on carbon emissions now cover 27% of all greenhouse gases globally. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but get this. Just back in 2018, that number was only 15%. So you can see there's a real trend here. More and more of the world is grabbing these economic tools and putting them to work.
Okay, now let's dive into what is probably the biggest debate in all of climate economics. If you want to make polluters pay, do you set the price directly with something like a tax, or do you cap the total amount of pollution and let the market figure out what the price should be?
And this really gets to the core trade-off. With a carbon tax, it's simple. The government says every ton of carbon you emit costs X dollars. Businesses love this because it's predictable. The catch? You don't know for sure how much pollution will actually be cut. An emissions trading system, or what people call cap and trade, does the exact opposite. It puts a firm cap on pollution. That's the environmental guarantee. But now, the price of a permit to pollute goes up and down with supply and demand. It's uncertain.
So, which one do you pick? Well, the great economist Martin Weitzman came up with a way to think about it. It basically goes like this. If your biggest fear is that the cost of cutting emissions turns out to be shockingly high and it could cripple your economy, you go with a tax. You get that price certainty. But if your biggest fear is crossing some catastrophic climate tipping point, you go with a cap and trade system. You absolutely guarantee that you won't go over your emissions budget.
But putting a price on the bad stuff, the pollution, isn't the only move. The toolbox also has a bunch of other clever tools. These are the carrots, the incentives designed to pull our energy system towards clean energy, instead of just pushing it away from the dirty stuff.
Okay, check this out. Take renewable energy certificates, or RECs. This is just a brilliant piece of market design. So when a solar farm makes electricity, it's really creating two things, the electron itself and its greenness, right? A REC basically unbundles that green attribute and turns it into its own product that can be bought and sold.
This lets a company, say in New York, buy the greenness from a wind farm in Texas. It's a huge deal because it creates an extra stream of money for renewable energy projects.
And then, of course, you've got subsidies, the classic carrot approach. And look, they can be amazing for helping new technologies like solar panels or electric cars get started when they're still expensive. But there's a pretty big downside. They cost governments a ton of money, they can mess with market prices, and here's the really ironic part. Subsidies for fossil fuels, they almost always end up helping wealthier households way more than poor ones.
So how do you pay for all this? Well, that's where tools like green bonds come in. A green bond is pretty simple, really. It's just a loan where the money raised is legally promised to go only to climate-friendly projects. This is a super important way to get the huge pools of private money, from pension funds and investors, flowing into building the clean infrastructure we desperately need.
Okay, so that's a lot of theory. But how does this stuff actually perform out in the wild? Does it work? Let's look at a few really powerful real-world examples.
First, take a look at Germany's Energiewende. That's their energy transition. A huge part of this was driven by a policy called a feed-in tariff, which basically guaranteed a good price for anyone producing renewable power. And the result? It's just staggering. They went from just 6% renewable electricity back in 2000 to over 50% today. That is a complete transformation of a country's power grid, all spurred by one smart policy.
Now let's jump over to the US. California has a big cap-and-trade system, and through its auctions of pollution permits, it has raised over $18 billion. But here's the really cool part. That money doesn't just disappear. It gets reinvested back into more climate projects in the state, which creates this amazing positive feedback loop.
And I want to be clear, this isn't just something happening in Europe and North America. In 2024, India launched its very own carbon trading scheme. It's just more proof that governments all across the world are picking up these economic tools and adapting them to meet their own climate targets.
So we have the tools, we can see they work, and countries are starting to use them. But that brings us to the final, and let's be honest, the most difficult part of this entire puzzle.
The sheer scale of what's needed is just mind-boggling. The best estimates say that to hit our global climate goals, the world needs to invest somewhere between $4 and $5 trillion every single year. I mean, that's just a number so big it's hard to even comprehend, and it's way, way more than we're spending today.
And there are still these massive hurdles in our way. Most of the carbon prices out there, they're still way too low to really drive the big changes we need. An incredible 73% of global emissions still have no price on them at all. Our electrical grids are aging and they can't handle all the new renewables we're trying to plug in. And maybe most importantly, we still haven't figured out how to make this a just transition, how to support the people and the communities whose livelihoods have been built on fossil fuels for generations.
So if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's this. The Economist toolbox is not empty, not even close. We have these incredibly powerful instruments, taxes and markets and bonds, that can literally steer the entire global economy in a new direction. The tools are there. They're on the table, ready to go. The only question left is whether we have the collective will to pick them up and build a blueprint that's actually big enough and bold enough to solve the problem.